Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Grantmakers for Education Out of School Time Impact Group monthly field convening call. This is a series of calls that if this is your first one joining us, you're welcome. We welcome you here to be with us. This is meant to be kind of a conversation. So we have speakers who join us and share ideas, but then we hope you'll join us in the conversation in the chat. My name is Rebecca Goldberg, and I co-facilitate the Impact Group with Kathleen Traphagen, who's here with me as well. And we are thrilled to bring in our speakers today and present this conversation because we're really interested in what you all think and want to get you engaged. Before we get started, I wanted to just share logistically, there's going to be quite a bit of presentation, although we're splitting it up and there's time to connect and there'll be some videos. But because we have some speakers speaking, if anyone's going too fast, feel free to use your reactions button. And there's a slow down left arrow. So I'm using it right now so you can see what it looks like, and then you can kind of take it off, or you can say speed up if that's the case. But just wanted to make sure that you have that option to let us know if anything's going too fast or too slow. We would love for you to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat. We've got a welcome prompt for you, which is setting us up for today's conversation. So the prompt is, in thinking about a learning ecosystem, what is one learning environment or an organization or an activity outside of the classroom that you benefited from as a young person? So thinking back in your own life, what is something that you engaged in that really had an impact or helped shape who you are today, to get us thinking about all the spaces that young people are engaging in. So, please also change your Zoom name if you can to include your pronouns and your organization. You can click on the 3 dots on your picture to do that. All right, so without further ado, I want to introduce the subject and our speakers. I'm so thrilled to be able to have Pittman and Merita Irby with us today. It's hard to introduce these two because they are really infamous in our field. And whether you know them personally or not, you know their work because youth development wouldn't look like what it looks like today without everything they've done to elevate our field, to promote the evidence, to bring together partners at all these important tables, and to really be champions for all of your work here on this call. We're going to throw their actual bios in the chat because I cannot do them justice, but I've had the pleasure of knowing them for many years and being in awe of their work and following in their footsteps as much as I can. And so you may know them as founders of the Forum for Youth Investment, and more recently of KP Catalyst, Knowledge to Power Catalyst. And they are doing just that, catalyzing ideas and movement and moving us into action. So we brought them here today because they've released a new report recently called Too Essential to Fail: Why Our Big Bet on Public Education Needs a Bold National Response. We were going to throw a lot of resources in the chat for you, so we'll include a link to that and other articles. And they recently convened a group of leaders earlier this month, and this is a continuation of that conversation to get it out to a broader audience. To do just that, to look at how do we bring together this learning ecosystem and really envision something that's better for our young people, that's more developmentally appropriate, and transforms that system into something that works. So everyone here is a key part of that work. I'm just gonna, let them come on, and Karen and Merita, please join us and share with us, why did you write this paper, why this paper, and why now?
Well, first, thank you for having us. This is really an exciting opportunity. It's really important for us to talk to a group of folks, researchers, funders, et cetera, who are thinking about out of school time and how we think differently about that. Because if we can't think differently about out of school time, we're not going to solve the public education problem. So I'll start with that. So with Catherine is here, and Catherine really is the managing partner of Knowledge to Power Catalyst. So we want to give her credit. And she's also the person who masters moving slides and dropping things into the chat. So she's going to do that for us. So you asked why we wrote the paper, and it's important to understand why we wrote the paper. 5 years ago, we were, or maybe 6 years ago, we were invited to be a part of the SEED Commission, the National Commission on Social and Emotional Academic Development. And with that, we were the youth development people in the group. We weren't the only ones. We were some of the few that were coming out from a youth development perspective. And that was pretty typical of us, that we were invited into education spaces as the people who understood youth development or out of school time, and those two are not quite synonymous. But in that group, we were able to create an ad hoc group of youth development organizations, and we were able to actually get funding to put out a paper called Building Partnerships in support of where, when, and how learning happens. That was really important to us because it allowed us to sort of have a show of force in which we changed the language. And go ahead and click one more time, Catherine. The graphic that ended up being put into that report ended up in the main report of the document, which was a big deal because we were able to change the language from teachers to educators, from students to learners, from classrooms to settings. We were able to broaden the language to give us room to have a conversation about how, where, when, and why learning happens. And this graphic in particular allowed us to get inside a school to say all learning settings aren't equal. Core academic classes are where you have the least freedom to learn, and it goes on out from that. So that was really an important step. But when the Seed Commission ended, our work wasn't ended. So on the next slide, Catherine, we formed a partnership with the National League of Cities, with the National Urban League and the American Institutes for Research to keep the work going under something called the Readiness Project, where we're still at the forum. And during that time, the 2 years we were there, we put out a paper that everybody contributed to called Thriving Robust Equity and Transformative Learning and Development, in which we really stepped back to look at these big questions of what is thriving and how is thriving different from where we started 20 years ago when we talked about positive youth development, what's happened in those spaces. We then joined the SOLD Alliance, the Science, Learning, and Development Alliance, worked with them on design principles for community-based settings. They were doing design principles for schools, and they were going to take that and hand it to community-based settings. We said, no, it's a different animal. They need to have their own playbook. So the same principles are there, but we wrote it for community-based settings. And then we really sponsored and supported Tom Akiva and Kim Robinson at the Whitewood Center, co-editing a book called Case and Ecosystem. So this has been a journey that we've been on to really get this conversation going. But once we got to KP Catalyst, next slide, we spent the next 2 years just digging in with some organizations that really were trying to move this idea of learner-centered, competency-based ecosystems, but starting from the school space. So we partnered with Education Reimagined and with XQ Institute. We've worked with them for the past 2 or 3 years. And we're pleased to say that all these things have ended up in big papers. So Equity Center at Thriving came out with AIR in February. February was also the month in which Too Essential to Fail came out. And then stay tuned, a paper from XQ Competencies will be coming out. XQ Institute will be coming out in May, looking at their competencies, which is really important. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. But that's really been the journey that we've been on. It's been a while to move these ideas forward. And we're excited that for the first time, they're really getting into education spaces because the earlier pieces that we did were important, but they really weren't read and embraced by educators. And so working with XQ and working with Education Reimagined allows us to put these things into an education audience. And that's important, frankly, because we talk about schools can't do it all, but what we know is that while schools have too much responsibility, OST has not enough responsibility, not enough resources, but also not enough responsibility for really owning learning. And that's what we wanted to work on today. So I'm going to hand it over to Merita to explain what's in the paper.
Yeah, and as we did the work on Too Essential to Fail, it really was like everything that we do. It was a collective process, right? So we did, for more than a year, we had been meeting with the folks who were leading different efforts that Karen mentioned. We also had a Science of Learning Development Alliance working group specifically focused on equitable ecosystems, and they really kind of held the monthly drumbeat with us of, I'll say they're the ones who read the 75-page version of the research and the paper and the whole back to the future of youth development. What do we know from 20 years and 30 years on of doing this work, that there is a foundation there to really connect. And so it really was that kind of collective process to shape and hone and dive more deeply into what I'll highlight in the sections. So we're definitely not alone in this journey. The premise really was starting with the idea that learning development ecosystems, they are happening now. This is not something off in the future. This is the life. You think of a young person, they traverse throughout their day, their week, their year, a lot of different places and spaces where learning and development happen. And there's a lot of people that they connect to throughout that, but not all of them are healthy. And they certainly aren't all, when you look across them, they're not equitable by any means. And so that was the how do we think about this in a new way, in a way that also really in this day and time where public education is also so under attack, really helps, but also working to improve, really helps imagine what a new role and path kind of going forward looks like as key stewards in that ecosystem. So this is where we started with, and it really is with that goal of how do we really build confidence in our collective ability to really support change that's happening at the local level, that's really connecting directly to the lives of young people and the learning ecosystems that include schools, but also are really far beyond what's happening in the school building. So that the schools without walls and learning happens everywhere kind of ideas, but really taking those to the next level. So in the paper itself, what we did, we have 4 sections. There's one that was really on the convergence of perspectives here. We did a dive into recent polling data and perspectives of parents, teachers, young people themselves, business leaders, and just looking at that kind of, there is an emerging, continuing consensus of what we want from our education system and what we want around learning and development and what young people want themselves. So we led with that. How does that help us in the current day, and that there's more consensus and convergence than maybe we know. Then really looking at the validation from research and going back 20 years and also bringing forward to the science of learning development and a lot of more recent kind of affirmations that we know from the research about how learning and development happen, bringing those and how that really drives you. A focus on thriving really drives you to think about all the places, spaces, and people and possibilities in an ecosystems approach. And then really thinking about where are key levers for change. And that's part of what this meeting that you mentioned, Rebecca, that we were looking at the last few weeks in the group, continuing to work on that. Like, what are some of those big swings? What are the footholds that are really, there's a lot of work, but how do we really lean in on that, including building on a lot of the capacity that's already there in communities to be able to steward this ecosystem. So building on local infrastructure, and then really thinking about a path forward that brings what we know about systems change and cross systems change and ecosystems management and stewardship into the mix to be able to think about how we move forward collectively, but in a different way.
Great. And I know you mentioned Education Reimagined. Could you just tell us a quick snippet about who they are and what they do?
Sure. Well, actually, if Emily's on the phone, she could tell us, or on the screen, she could tell us herself. But and Peter Walters is here. Education Reimagined is, I think, about a 15-year-old, not Peter, if that's about right, organization that was really set up to reimagine education, to say, if we're going to go from these principles of learner-centered, competency-based, relationship-driven, if we're going to, community-owned, we can't get there from where we are. They're really set up to say the current education system isn't just outdated. It's so locked in that we have to really reimagine, not transform education, but reimagine what education is and reimagine what education systems are. And so they have really been building a very dynamic network of what they call learner-centered schools and education systems across the country that are embodying these ideas. They got to the place last year of saying, we've got enough bright spots. We know that these things exist, but how do you scale them and grow them? How do we get to those system change things? And so that's what they're working on now. They're saying, how do we actually work with a couple of places? Their goal is 5 places in 5 years, where they really have come in and worked with that community to rebuild the infrastructure. And if I didn't get that right, Pete's nodding, so I think I see him on the screen. He's saying I did it right. So that's who they are. And it was so exciting to work with them, because, and really an honor for us to write this paper with them, because they trusted us as youth development people to say, how do we really think about this thing in a way that's very different? And our message has been, we can't get there without really engaging the out of school time youth development group in a very different way than we had before. And that's really the message that we're bringing home. And they were open to that message already, so it's great.
Thank you for that. The partnership makes a lot of sense. Excellent. So you've made the case that we need to start by rethinking how learning happens and what learning matters. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Would love to do that. I think we'd like to do that with a little video clip if we can. So, and I'll tee it up for you. But I think one of the challenges that we have, we've been talking for a long time about learning happens everywhere, and when and where learning happens, and blurring the lines between school and community. But I think we're finding increasingly, and this has been a big focus of all of this work, including with the Science of Learning Development Alliance and XQ Institute, is also just how do we have the mindset shift, not just about where and when, but what learning itself actually looks like, and the challenge of making that mindset shift when we all of us do. We've all been, through school. We all have very powerful ideas of what learning should look like. And we just want to share with you this clip from XQ Institute about how it's a challenge for our young people as well, to think about learning in a different way. So Catherine, I think you've got this teed up for us. Let's just watch this for 2-3 minutes.
We are the pioneer class of Crosstown High School.
Come on, ladies, pick it up! Pick it up, pick it up!
Y'all are messing with us.
Where I come from, it's like pencil, paper, lecture. You come to Crosstown, it's completely different.
You need to develop a deep understanding. That might be through research, that might be through your own pondering of your own self.
There's room for all kinds of projects. I have another student who's making a dome that they're going to put on Mars, and they have ants. Ants are going to be the people.
I had a student tell me the other day that going to Crosstown doesn't feel like going to school. But you know what the interesting thing was is she was like upset about that.
Students oftentimes are still thinking in traditional models and modes of thinking. You really got to think about this differently.
The way it's set up is that you don't really know that you're learning. So it's like tricking you into learning.
Where's the content in this? What am I doing?
They want that ache of actually like feeling that they're learning, a little pulse in their head.
Here we go. Everybody, quiet. Shh. All right, what we're about to do, because I've had like 1,000 complaints, like I've learned nothing this quarter. So that's how you feel. I'm going to show you how that is not true, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass out an EOC test. It's this big old test that you have to take at the end of the year. I've heard these grumblings and rumblings of like, we haven't learned anything. I'm trying to show them that we actually did cover these standards that are required by the state. All right, take one, pass around. All right, hey, no more talking. Now you're gonna use your reasoning skills to answer this test.
She's like, because y'all think y'all not learning anything, have this test. And it's like a standardized state test that she gave us.
I get this test and I take it and I'm just like answering the stuff subconsciously. Like I'm not even realizing that I'm having no problem answering these questions.
We did it, and I was like, wow, it was super easy. And I finished it with no problem.
I didn't think I was learning anything. I take this test and I'm like killing it. You can't come in here thinking, I'm gonna just take notes and listen to the teacher. You can be your best teacher. At Crosstown, you have to become comfortable in being uncomfortable. It's something different every day.
Are we learning anything? It doesn't feel like school. When it's exactly the kind of thing that the kind of learner-centered, project-based, if we think about enrichment, that's like the combination of engagement and enthusiasm and enjoyment and learning, it's like, it's how do we get there from here is part of what all these groups are asking, because it is so driven by, in even our young people's minds, by like how am I showing up on the test? How can I be validated in this? And what are ways to really think about that differently? So that we just shared that to sort of like the mindset shift of what we know about good learning and how it happens, and that it's really driven through good development. The development really is the approaches on what we know about youth development and relationship rich and lead with interest and all of these things, that if it doesn't look like it's in the box of learning as traditionally understood, then maybe it's not happening. And when we saw this, we saw the premiere on this, Karen, your comment, yeah.
Yeah, we were in DC with the premiere with about 300 people who were all, true believers in educational transformation. And when the question was asked, when the student said, I don't think I'm learning anything, you saw the room get silent, and you saw the test. When the teacher announced that everybody passed the test with flying colors, the room broke into spontaneous applause, and people got a standing ovation because you got validation that you can enjoy learning. This idea that if you're enjoying yourself, you're not learning what's important is so deeply ingrained in who we are that we've got to just challenge it, and that's what we're trying to do. So, Catherine, if you can put the slides back up, we'll keep going.
And is that the grammar of schooling? I see that in the chat. It's like, how are we even talking about this and thinking about it and feeling and experiencing it differently? So that clip came from a school that the XQ Institute has been working through in their Rethinking High Schools initiative. And another piece of work that they're tackling together along with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which came out with a announcement, it's been more than a year, a couple years now, to say that they've sort of been the shepherds of the Carnegie unit, that kind of seat time equals, credit, to think about how you get credit for learning based upon something else, based upon actually what you're learning, about the competencies, the skills, the things that you're really trying to get through those learning experiences. So how do we think about that and how we think about assessment differently? And I share this slide just to focus on what the piece that we did for XQ recently that's coming out in May was really trying to look at, while they've done validation work around their academic competencies, the holders of foundational knowledge, the masters of fundamental literacies, and really did a comparison to the 50 plus state standards related to that, really looking at the cognitive, social, emotional competencies as well, and saying, how do these compare to relate with what we know about what it takes to develop those competencies in that framework? And the kind of really cool thing about what they did is looked at how, and this is Michelle Cahill and Lauren Beerbaum and the team there, really looked at how the cognitive really ran across all of them. And it's not just that cognitive is over here and social emotional is over here. So it's one of those things that whether you think about SEL and the kind of the divide that's happened a little bit, if this happens in this space and academic happens in another, how you're really bridging that, or how we're doing this in out of school time settings, that is really bringing that across, that intentionality of connecting in any learning experience, how these things combine is a key part of what they're thinking about in terms of designing powerful learning experiences.
So go to the next slide, Catherine. And there's so much for XQ to share with you, but we thought we'd just share. For us, the huge deal is that they have taken these 5 outcome areas and they've put them into the same rubric. And it's a rubric that is a learner-centered rubric. The questions are I can, I will, I am, language. It's learner-centered. And they've paired this set of outcome areas, all using the same kind of rubric and metrics, all progressing from, level 1 to level 4 of, I'm starting it to I've mastered it. And they've then put that with a set of design experiences, really saying, if you're going to get those outcomes, you have to think every experience has to be meaningful and almost transformative. So it's yes, you can absolutely get the slides and many more things that go along with it. But it's just so important that we have this singular way to say academic content and academic standards are there and it's important, but they don't get activated until you put them into something that's meaningful and relevant and rigorous and interesting for young people. So the combination of the outcomes and the learning experiences and how these come together is why we start to talk about development-driven learning. So back to you, Merita. Go ahead, Catherine.
And so much of our grounding and thinking on this, and we're just kind of highlighting some of the research base that we brought together in the Too Essential to Fail, and it's what you saw in the little clip that we just saw. That really thinking about the connections of these, the making of meaning, that development is jagged. So the key findings of what we know about how learning and development happen, and how those translate into really thinking about each and every experience that young people are involved in, and how they really start with relationships and that sense of belonging, but that you're also integrating in with that. Yes, the blue wheel, our fondly named blue wheel, the rich learning experiences and the skills development, that there is sort of these all connect together, but there's also starting points in terms of this work. So how are we really doing that in ways that are centering the thriving and the learning and development of young people? As you think about that, and you think about that then for what's happening in out of school time settings, and I think the next one is really highlighting the work from Learning Heroes, which is this is a survey that they did a while back on what parents thought about why they kind of went for different settings, what they expected from different places and spaces where learning happens, and that there is things that they all have in common, but there's kind of the thinking of the basic skills developing in school, but the out and about is that place where you really have an opportunity to develop the teamwork, the confidence, the leadership, the kind of interest-driven, vote with your feet learning opportunities. So as we think about and dive in a little bit more to what we're seeing from teachers and from parents in terms of that, the next one shows you a little bit of what came out of their data, just like the top motivations for going for parents in terms of the value of OST programs, and then also what teachers think about it. And you look at the list, and 4 out of the top 5 for each is really the same. It's new experiences, it's voice and passion, it's success, it's allowing them to express themselves, fit in, and the one difference, still high, I think, on both lists, but the one difference in their top 5 is for parents, it's the interaction with others, the diverse races, ages, backgrounds. But if you look in over at teachers who really see the value of OST programming, it's the getting children motivated and excited about learning, even those who aren't doing well in school. The idea that there's a place that they can show up and get engaged. And it's sort of the challenge in some ways when we talk with classroom teachers and educators is they want that to be in the classroom too, but often find because of the restrictions that they have on what they can do in their own creativity in that space that they're just hoping kids get it somewhere and can get that love of learning and then bring it back into the classroom. That's one of the things that we're trying to think, well, how do you crack that nut? How do you really kind of change that?
One more, Catherine. So this is why the conversation with OST funders and researchers and practitioners is so important. Because when you look at, when Learning Heroes asked, are you satisfied? You've got excellent and very good. 85% of parents are happy with what's happening in out of school time with their kids. Now, not all of them can afford it. Only 2/3 of kids can get it. We've got demand issues, but that's very different from when Populace asked, what do you want to change about education? And everybody said, we want a lot of things to change. Some people said we want everything to change about education. So we've got this dissatisfaction with our formal education system, but that is free, that is compensatory. And then we've got satisfaction with our voluntary system. We've got to get the flexibility and the customization of what's happening in out of school time paired in with the reliability and functionality of our free public education system. We've got to do that together. We can't just run along the side.
And we have to do that in ways that are equitable. Parents and caregivers right now are spending about $200 billion a year on the kind of learning and opportunities that happen outside of school.
Right.
And that's what, 7 to 1 of like in terms of income level, in terms of what they're spending. So it's just not fair.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is a good transition to thinking about those learning ecosystems. So I loved the example of the XQ school, the high school being really an ideal learning environment. It looked like that was mostly an in-classroom experience, not necessarily the inclusion of community organizations. So would love for you to share the concept of the learning ecosystem and why that's so compelling and relevant right now.
Yeah, start on this one.
So when we're doing this, we want to start with this. We want to be really bold in this assertions because we are. Schools really have the social legitimacy through their regulatory systems. They get tax dollars. Students are required to attend. They control academic, content and academic credentialing. They're not bad. That's just what they are. And the youth organizations don't have that. So what we have, if we have legitimacy, we have legitimacy through shared understanding, through social expectations, through cultural support. This is actually a quote from a paper that Tom McKeevan and Dale O'Connor and I wrote in 2020. But we want to make 2 assertions that are getting us to ecosystems. Realizing the promise of learning ecosystems requires us to expand beyond our narrow views of learning. And that's what you saw in the XQ video. It also really requires us to expand very clearly our notions of the adults who support learning and development. And so I'm going to keep going from there. Both of those things, we have to broaden our definition of learning, and how it happens, we have to broaden our definition of who it happens with. And so using ecological thinking actually changes how we see the ecosystem itself. We think there's a big difference between talking about services coordination and talking about ecosystem development and ecosystem growth and health. Because ecosystems really are dynamic. They're constellations of intertwined elements. We talked about people, places, and possibilities. Dale Blythe is on the call, I saw. We talked about this together. It's this dynamic interaction between people, places, and possibilities. It's not that you put the kid in the center, you pour things into the kid. That young person is out in the ecosystem, actually changing the ecosystem, interacting with the ecosystem. And so it's only by taking a deeper look at understanding the dynamic processes of learning ecosystems that we can better figure out how to manage our systems to create more equitable opportunities. We're not getting rid of systems. And that's the dilemma. People often think, oh, ecosystem, we don't need systems. We absolutely need systems, but systems can't operate alone. And just having systems use system level coordination isn't sufficient. So keep going, Catherine. We wanted to share with you a quick example of what an ecosystem looks like when it's mapped. Now, we talk a bit about a learning and development ecosystem. It's huge, it's endless. There are lots of combinations, but you can say learning for what? You can, if you narrow down the possibilities or the people or the place, you get to a number of ecosystems that are in there together. So in Pittsburgh, they said, we want every young person to have opportunities to get to creative arts, theater, dance, drama, etc. We want them to do that. How can we, as a diverse set of organizations, understand who we are so we can better support young people getting those possibilities? So Tom McKeeb and his colleagues actually went out and they did a series of studies to actually talk to word of mouth people and ask them, who are the organizations you know in this system? And then they developed this map. It's interesting that the size of the organization didn't determine its centrality in the network. The networks change over time. These are dynamic networks. But by mapping them and bringing them together to say, you are an ecosystem of different organizations that are all supporting the same chance of increasing young people's possibilities for participation in the arts, how can you work together better to guarantee more equitable supports for those young people? And that's what they did. But they had to map, they had to know that they existed. They had to understand how they relate to each other. And they had to do this. And this is really going to come through with the idea of a keystone species. The people in these systems are critical.
The other thing just to emphasize in that, so you see the triangles, right, which are some of the hubs, like the folks that helped connect multiple other players in the system. And if we think about that, this again is in creative arts, but if you go to the OECD scenarios that we've been kind of zooming in on here, it's really thinking about what it looks like for schools to play a learning hubs role. So keeping a lot of the main functions, keeping a lot of the functionality that they have in terms of being able to affirm kind of credit, for example. There's a lot of work that's happening across states and in multiple places of giving credit for learning that's happening in places and spaces outside of school. But that they're keeping those kinds of functionality, but they're really, and it is this kind of schools without walls example, that they really are helping to connect people in multiple places and spaces that are offering learning. So there's a couple of ways that we want to dive into the idea of the hubs and learning hubs and what the role is that schools can play in terms of that, and also the roles that different aspects of infrastructure and community can play in that mode.
The idea of having schools as learning hubs is having that really go beyond where we are right now, which is we have community schools, which are great, which are bringing community in to do wraparound services, et cetera. Expanding the time the learning is happening in the school day, but you still have it school-centered. The idea that you can have a learning hub, that the school can maintain the functionality of making sure every kid is getting learning that they need, but can do that in a way that's supporting competency-based education with the assumption that competencies really have to be built out in the community, that you have young people have to have real life experiences. So the question is, how do we optimize the people, places, and possibilities that exist? And one of the things that we found when working with schools is, or school leaders, is they often think of the community as this amorphous thing. So the National League of Cities during the pandemic developed this graphic, this wonderfully colorful graphic that said, we can think of communities as learning hubs that can support learning, because we have all these institutions in the community that are standing around working with young people voluntarily, but they are places and spaces that have people where young people go, and young people go there independent of their families. So go to the next slide, Catherine. And just click through them quickly. We know that schools are the primary institution and that they're not just doing academics, they're doing really multi-service agencies. Keep going. We know the community institutions are there and that they offer basic services. They have direct relationships with families. They offer learning opportunities, but they're not connected to schools. Keep going, Catherine. We know that families are there, as Merita said, but they're recognizing and working and valuing after-school programming as community programming, but they have to pay for it. So it's not equitable. This is what we want to point out. This keystone species wasn't in the picture. And when we really say, who are the people who are in these settings, who are working differently on these different important opportunities that young people need to have, we recognize really quickly, when you talk to any of them, they're not bringing their full selves into their jobs. Their jobs, however, are somewhat constraining what they can do. If you get out of school, you can have a lot of chance to have the freedom to have possibilities, but you only get the kids out of school time, and you have to go find them voluntarily. You don't get everything that you need. And so what we want to do is to think about how we can really strengthen that keystone species. That's the list that came up from Power of Us survey to talk about who the keystone species is. So we're really giving roles and definitions. We know that there's some infrastructure out there to support learning and development already. From children's cabinets, you can click again, Catherine. From
Jessica, your point right here about
provider networks, coordinating bodies, cross-sector labs, community campaigns. We know that they're out there, and we know that they're supporting existing infrastructure. But these are all hampered, frankly, by this old-fashioned definition of learning that says we'll do the things to support the kids so they can get into the classroom and learn. We're actually not blowing up the classroom to say the learning needs to happen in its project-based, community-centered spaces. One more. So what we need to do is to think about a new architecture for learning and development ecosystems. And what we need to do is to do that by saying, whoop, I need to actually those build quickly, but you can see we determine that set of people with the keystone species to get them connected to each other, get them using their jobs more fully. And then we really do need to think about how we more broadly and purposely engage the whole community, all the actors in the community, in supporting this idea of community as places where learning are happening, not just organizations, but people. And so the thing that we wanted to point to next, and then we're going to stop talking to you, is go ahead, Catherine, to the next slide. When you think about those people outside of the system, we often think we need volunteers, but we bring our volunteers in and they bring even less of themselves in because you say, I need somebody to do X in my organization. What if we could create, and Josh Chapper is on the call with us, I think, what if we could create a human library? We could think about the people in our communities as real resources that we can tap into fully. And I'm going to stop there and let Josh explain what we're talking about. He wants to, but it's really this bigger idea that we need all of the change that we need to do really needs to focus on us empowering and engaging the adults that are working with young people directly to make sure that they understand that they have more supports to connect with each other so that they can work with young people more clearly, and that they have supports from their systems, not just to do their job, but to connect across systems. So we will stop there and see if that made any sense and take more questions.
Did you want Josh to come on, or
is Josh in the room?
I'll invite you to come up if you want to.
Oh, hello. I am in the room. Thank you so much for sharing about Community Share. I'll just do a 1 minute sort of expansion on that. So I'm the founder and director of Community Share, and as Karen was saying, for me it was really the idea that we all have lived experiences, and often when we engage the community, we're not thinking about how do we bring the whole human and the whole, connecting them to the whole young person. And so what we found over the last 10 years is that people want to contribute, but sometimes it's not what sort of their occupational expertise or knowledge, but sometimes it's just their lived experience, whether they know the neighborhood history or whether they're the first to go to college. So how do we reveal the amazing and rich assets of our community and connect those in ways that educators and young people can tap into? And for me, it's about co-creating learning experiences that enable young people to contribute not only to their own learning, but contribute to the health and vitality of the community. So really thinking of learning in service of creating healthy communities instead of thinking of learning and just around learning itself. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Josh.
And one of the things I love about the work, there's a visual that Josh uses about the stewards. That what we're talking about and why we looked it up as an example is we have a lot of things already in place. We have a lot of infrastructure. We have a lot of things that are helping with coordination and kind of partnerships. But what are those roles that really focus on the connections across the adults and the young people in the ecosystem, and who plays those roles? How do even some of the existing infrastructure that we have play those kinds of roles that really help steward that ecosystem and steward those connections across. So that's it. It doesn't work without. It's not just like I think you've described it, Josh, as like that particular one, the human library is almost like a match.com for people who are trying to create powerful learning experiences, but it's much more than a platform. It takes somebody who's really focused on helping to support and make those connections happen.
I love the idea of the keystone species. It certainly connects to the conversations we've been having around the importance of the workforce. And you've also elevated the role of the volunteer workforce. I know some folks on this call are thinking a lot about that around all of the enrichment that programs look for. And that can be through volunteers, it could be teaching artists, it could be professionals in the community. So I love that. I mean, maybe move us towards action. So what is one thing everyone on this call could do to push us towards this transformed system? You know, we've got practitioners, we have researchers, we've got intermediary leaders, we have policy folks, we have funders. How do we push folks forward?
Well, I'm going to be pushy. Susie said I could push folks forward and say, I think one of the things everybody could do is to change our language, because we're a part of the problem. If we want school to change, we can't be the out of school time people. If we're going to get into the building, we have to talk about the fact that what we have is a rich, deep history of research, policy, and practice around positive development. And positive development, it happens in every space, in every setting, in every system, and everybody can be moving towards those goals. And positive development, if we understand it, because it is the development of young people and their sense of agency and identity, has to also be youth driven. And so all the principles that we have that are hard to get into the schools because of how schools are built are there in the PYD approach, in the PYD philosophy, and in PYD practice, and in the infrastructure that we've been building around this work. And so if we're going to have these conversations, and this really does trickle down, we have to really be bold to say enriched learning is the best learning. And enriched learning happens when, and then we have to be very specific about what that means. It means all the things we get in the XQ. It means it's interest driven. It means it's rigorous. It means it's relevant to young people. It means it's bringing in those core competencies and fundamental knowledge and building them into ways that are relevant for young people and doing meaning making. Those are all possible, but I think we have to really think about how funders break down the silos in their own foundations between education and youth development, how researchers stop only researching out of school time. We know that there are roles. When we look at the keystone species and we look at the roles that those people have, those roles go across system lines. I can be a librarian in a school. I can be a librarian in a community. I can be a librarian in a rec center. I can be a librarian in lots of places. I can be a counselor in lots of places. I can be a youth worker in lots of places. And so when we start to think about the keystone species and where they are, it allows us to be much more sensitive to the fact that you have a role that someone is trained to do, that they're combining with their life experiences, that is somewhat constrained by the organization that hires them automatically, because that organization has a goal and a job and a responsibility to do things. But if I really understand that role, I know part of my job has to be understanding that young people, when they leave my program, are going someplace else. And the more I know about where they're going, and the more I know about the people that they're working with, the better I'll be able to support young people. And we need our systems to support that language and to support those ideas. So this idea of thinking about how we are stewards of an ecosystem, how that's about adaptive management, is something that we have to get into all of our places. We've got the experience to understand how to do this. We've sat back to say, we'll do the wraparound services, we'll do the enrichment learning, but we're not going to get into the classroom. And we have to break down what the classroom is and bring it out.
I want to speak to that, Karen. Peter McWalters, I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. I'm the chairman of Big Picture Learning, and I've been in this same question with Karen for a long time now, but a couple of things I want to emphasize. One is it starts with relationships, both with the children and the fundamental image that Karen's been creating for us, that right now schools have been insidiously constructed, not consciously, but insidiously, to own it and keep everybody else out of it. And you can't get certification for learning any place except in school. And I'm exaggerating intentionally. The core of this is realizing the very simple notion that learning is always going on every time. Kids are learning all the time. And the work of teaching isn't teaching, it's learning. So I would argue here that the places we've already seen this going on has come, if you understand the big frame, and I think this is the best framing I've ever seen, is that you have to start in the community with outreach to like-minded people in these different components. And you have to start a conversation in your community about the centrality of learning and the centrality of each and every child. And then you have to come up with examples of out of school time that is no longer out of school time after school. It is related to the work going on in school, and judgments about what the children are going to be doing, who's scaffolding their learning. And I think the XQ exercise is a dramatic example of the kind of discipline that has to go in to the pedagogy behind this. And that's the same, that's whether you're in school or out of school. There's lots of work to do in terms of developing the capacity on all of these. But the first piece is getting the idea sold that we are responding to a demand that's already made. I think these graphs, these results of these survey comparisons would suggest that we have to present this as if we're saying yes to a demand that's already out there, and working with a few critical players, whether it's the business community, the kind of after school network communities. But we've got to get passionate people ready to start thinking about what does it mean when I'm making decisions in schools with the children in partnership with their parents about a project that is going to be going on out of school time. Who am I working with? What are the relationships? How are the judgments made? That kind of technical work is understood as a backdrop, but the first piece is developing the connections at some community level. And the examples I can give you are some things like in Iowa Big, they spent 2 years doing the development work of getting the community ready to give serious time and energy and money to out of school, after school, and during school projects. So to me, it's a community organizing exercise, and it's going to be from the power of the outside coming into schools and wrestling in a good faith with this decision about what constitutes learning, what constitutes scaffolding, and what constitutes accrediting learning. And that's usually best done by showing the examples of performance-based exhibitions where multiple people on panels are making decisions about what's good enough. And once you see it done enough, it's almost self-evident that that is where we got to be going.
That's right.
You talk about a community organizing approach. Sorry, Rebecca. I was going to pick up one of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, me too. So one of the things I want to bring in, so, is been lots of just a couple questions around this funding piece. And I think the power, and, Peter, you just kind of brought it up, that there's power in who has the funding. And in our current system, as you said earlier, Karen, schools have that tax funding, right? And they still have that funding. And we have all these great programs and demand for what's happening outside the school day. But how do we wrestle with that power dynamic and funding need, especially as the ESSER funding is about to end, for these programs to truly be integrated? How do we get to that level of transformation of a system?
Yeah. Well, one thing to do, and I'll give this answer quickly, and it's why we're so excited about working with XQ and Education Reimagined and bringing their thinking together, is that when you really start to do this with the focus on the school, and they're focusing on high schools, when they ask young people what they need and what they want, not only do they get project-based learning, we want relationships, we want wellness clinics, we want time in our communities. They dictate what's needed. And what you see is when you give the school the freedom to change, they actually reduce their time. Schools have the money. They have the money, but they also have the lock on the time and the accreditation. If we can loosen those two things, we have much more room for other organizations that are willing to step up and say, we can help build those competencies. We can tell you which competencies you want to build, and we can help you have the assessments that show that those competencies are being built. We want to get credit for learning. The After School Alliance has built a wonderful map of credit for learning happening all across the country with out of school time organizations doing it and supporting that credit. We've got it. We have to change our language to be able to get there. Because if we can say, and this is what XU has done, they've said, let's take a day out of school and let kids be out in the community. How do you build the infrastructure to make sure every kid has a half day to a day in a community thing? It's not just a volunteer community service thing. It's something where the learning is happening as much or more there as it's happening at the school. Those are the kind of things that we can do together. And Lucas, I saw your comment about COVID and COVID parents coming out. We've got to give parents and young people, as you saw on that clip, the confidence that the kind of excited learning that they're seeing happening in their communities when they're doing interest-driven learning, they are actually building the skills needed to succeed. A different way of assessing competencies so that we're giving kids credit for learning, and we're getting over this thing of, if they're having fun, they're not learning the hard stuff. There's so many ideas that we have that aren't true, that we have to give parents real ways to validate their own thinking.
And I would just add into the mix on that. I think the folks working directly with young people, young people definitely need to talk about community organizing as an approach on this. Parents, caregivers, young people, but also the people who are directly working with young people, including teachers. We just spent a half day with the leadership at the National Education Association. That's the last place that I just heard it needs to be a community organizing approach. And this was from the folks working, with classroom educators, as well as people playing all those, the 50% of people in school systems that are not in the classroom, playing those other roles in community. So one of the questions back in the chat was like, how much do people have a sense that they're the keystone species? I would say that the idea that there's workforce and volunteers, work and near peers working directly with young people, that do they see themselves as part of an interconnected space? Not yet, but I think that's one of the key things that we need to look at, the allied youth fields. How do we push towards that understanding of, we're in the same business, we may get trained in different spaces and we need to get more cross-trained, but how are we seeing that, and also seeing that we can in our pathways be able to kind of scaffold across different kinds of places and spaces as a part of that workforce.
Yep. And reading in the chat, yes, absolutely. Debating as to, is there room for PYD to get better? Absolutely. We have to get better if we're going to play in this game. If we're going to say we know how to do this stuff well enough that we can take some of the time, some of the resources, and some of the responsibility for learning and development, we have to be able to prove it. We've had the luxury of just saying we can do relationships with kids and make them feel safe and make them have fun and bring in some of the PYD. But if we're going to put it to the test, we have to be prepared to step up. And that's where the XQ competencies and this idea that we can have the same playbook across settings is so important.
So I'm wondering, are there any school districts that you've come across, Karen, Merita, and thanks for being here, Peter. I'm going to take the spotlight off. XQ is an amazing example, but are there other districts, the traditional districts, like maybe even Pittsburgh, where you've highlighted that ecosystem exists? Are you seeing that the ecosystem work in a way that is a model for others, within that traditional public school district system?
Yeah, Pittsburgh is a wonderful example. The ecosystem is growing and improving and strengthening. Those connections, that web is getting there. It's getting there in spite of the fact that the system isn't changing as fast. The public school system isn't changing as fast, but the visibility of the learning that's happening outside and the language is changing. So Greg Beer at the Grable Foundation is in Remake Learning. Is really, they're having a meeting in May in which they're bringing people from across the country to see what it looks like when you really have given the community the responsibility, the permission, and the visibility of having learning experiences out in their community in all different kind of ways. Schools are involved. Now, whether the school system has actually changed everything that it's done, I don't know. Up at the top system level, it probably still has a ways to go. But the fact that the community, as Peter is saying, is seeing learning happening everywhere, the language and the mentality is changing. And I think that's really important. The other thing that I'll say really quickly is, when we think about school, we have to think about the half of the people in the building who are not in the academic classroom, because they have roles and responsibilities for learning. If we can get schools to understand that they're building a community inside their walls, in which all those adults are bringing their full selves into work with young people across all the competencies they need to have, it'll be easier for us to break down the walls.
Thank you. So obviously there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on all fronts, right? We need more people talking to each other. We need conversations about what we actually want for young people. We need young people leading those conversations. And there's a lot of coordination and support needed to bring that keystone species together across all those settings. So I just wanted to appreciate having you both here, pushing everyone's thinking, giving us lots of food for thought here to bring back to our communities. You know, we want to hear from you all. So we'll post all of these resources on our event page afterwards. But just want to share my gratitude, Karen and Merita, for leading our field and for all the time and preparation you put into today's session. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for all of your thoughts in the chat. Wanted to share what's coming up next. So these are our monthly calls. And next month, we're going to be elevating mental health, and it's Mental Health Awareness Month. So we'll be talking about some models for supporting young people's mental health in out-of-school time. And we think we'll be continuing that into June because that's such a big conversation. And for our Ed Funders members on the call, we'll also have a funder meetup in June, and invite you to join us on June 4th for that. So without further ado, I think we'll close it out and on time. So thank you everyone for being here. Have a wonderful weekend.